Imagine a war city on the move, a grinding machine with a hospital at its heart. Under a canvas roof, you bite a strap while a saw bites bone and a hot iron hisses. The air stinks of wine and honey as lines of wounded are patched, burned, and sent back to march. Mercy or machine logic? Could you survive one day? Rome healed you to use you. Inside, the valetudinarium canvas flaps billow, and a line of men waits to be cut, cauterized, and either carried back to the ranks or left for discharge. Celsus recommended washing wounds with wine, and probing boldly Galen taught that stopping blood came before anything else. Both rules shaped every decision under canvas. A surgeon's chest carried some 40 bronze tools, saws, probes, forceps, so an amputation could be begun and finished in hours rather than days, and that speed often decided who lived. Vegetius warned commanders to staff camps with trained medici and capsara. Neglect cost cohesion and lives. Wax tablets logged names, injuries, and treatments for returns and discharge. Orderlies bathed linens in boiling water when they could honey and vinegar sealed wounds, because smell and time were the Romans' only antiseptics. Stretcher teams of 4 hauled you over flagstones, and mud caligae slapped oil, and pitch stuck to leather. There is no modern anesthetic. Emetic smears, crushed poppy and mandrake pours, strong wine pins, a leather wad between clenched teeth. How much pain could you bear? A brazier cracks as cautery irons glow red. The heat burns flesh and seals vessels in one motion, trading agony for mobility. The first 3 days are the cruelest timetable. Surgeons measure risk by hours, not sentiment. And archaeological bones show men who survived brutal surgeries and marched again. A valetudinarium could hold 300–500 patients, roughly a tenth of a legion on campaign. That capacity forced surgeons to amputate or stitch fast and to send the patch back to duty, because a stalled column meant defeat. 4 bearers hauled you to the tent. That hour decided whether capsara could stem rot. Capsarae hold the first vital watches. At the front, capsarae are the first hands on the dying, a man attached to each century of roughly 80 soldiers trained to staunch blood and drag you clear. Behind them stand the cohort and legion medici, roughly 1 medicus per 250 men in some records, working under the medicus castrorum, who runs the camp hospital and its valetudinarium. Celsus advised washing wounds with wine. Galen insisted stop the bleeding before anything else, because speed, not miracle, saved men. Could those first hands save you? The capsarius carries a capsa of wool and strips splints small enough to sling on a mule, and runs into gunpowder smoke of battle wine, stings the nose as a dressing is poured, and time collapses into short orders. If a century pours out with dozens down, 1 medicus cannot see them. All triage becomes arithmetic: who walks, who is carried, who waits. That arithmetic shapes choices, ligature or cautery, extraction or amputation, and shapes outcomes. Archaeological finds show healed amputations and skull surgeries, proof that many did survive surgical brutality. Orderlies, freedmen, specialists, and enlisted dressers move like a chain bandage, carry, cut, convalesce. Vegetius warned camp neglect invites collapse, and commanders knew a legion could grind into attrition without steady care. A medicus castrorum also managed supply lines. A valetudinarium might hold 300–500 patients when a fort swelled, and missing ointments or linen meant more deaths by infection. Tubi and caligae mark time. Trumpets clear lanes so stretcher bearers can run. Without a cleared lane and a mule to haul the wounded, extraction stalls and survival drops. 5 minutes decide life or death and send you toward the tent. The mule carries the wounded inland. At first contact, capsarae push through the press, 1 attached to each century of roughly 80 men. To drag the bleeding out, strap a tourniquet high and shout the casualty's name, while trumpet blasts carve lanes through the column. Vegetius warned that speed mattered. A strap cinched above an artery can mean the difference between walking and dying within minutes, so these bandage bearers carry wool slings and water skins as standard. Could you hold still while a leather gag pressed between your teeth and a mule bumped beneath you? Polybius praised that disciplined lanes were life itself. A tourniquet applied within 5 minutes could save a life while condemning a limb. Vexilla flapped wine and hot leather stung the nostrils. Celsus urged probing and bold cutting, because hesitation bred rot medici with Greek training and freedman surgeons stood just behind the line under the medicus castrorum ready to triage by priority and function. A cloak stretcher moves 3 men at a time. A single mule can haul 1 wounded and 1 attendant, and every lost animal slows the whole column. Helped off the killing ground is only the start capsara hand you to orderlies who pack wounds with honey or vinegar, and then the loud choice arrives: amputate, extract, or stitch, because the army's arithmetic is brutal and efficient. Survive the first 72 hours, and the medica often held 20-40 wounded under a single medicus. The surgeon takes over with cauteries and saws and decides whether you march or die. Axles cut the time to surgery. Inside the medica, the work is blunt and bureaucratic, a chest of tools, a brazier, and a surgeon whose decisions will be measured in marches saved or men lost. Celsus urged washing with wine or vinegar, and cutting boldly when hesitation killed. Galen, trained among gladiators, made controlling hemorrhage the first rule. The chest often held 40 instruments, and 2 assistants steadied the patient, while the cautery iron was heated red, an instrument hissing in wine and flame. You are stripped, strapped, and prepped. The probe finds dark flesh, the bronze forceps close, and a saw waits if bone will not yield. How much pain can you take? The answer is not virtue, but logistics. A single unchecked artery can empty a man by the hour and slow a unit's march. Remedies are crude arithmetic: strong wine, crushed poppy, henbane smeared on the gums, a leather wad between the teeth. And speed replaces anesthesia. Minutes shaved from an operation mean fewer bodies left to haul. The medicus castrorum expects return to duty, not convalescence, so choices favor the army. Commanders measured care by marching speed, and glory. Polybius noted medics rode with the baggage train and supplies. A contubernium shared a tent, and a centurion counted 3 days before a wounded man either marched or was reassigned. The tubi blare outside, and Caligae scrape the stones. The clock is visible in every incision. 1 pack mule carried about 90 kilograms of supplies, and losing it meant no wine or poppy for operations, so surgeons rationed opiates and tightened leather straps. Lose the mule and wine fails. Inside the medica, a medic slaps crushed poppy and mandrake on your gums, pours wine over a rag, and reads the wound like a ledger. Celsus urged bold cutting where hesitation killed, and Galen, drawn from gladiator schools, ordered bleeding controlled first. These instructions are law when dozens of men must be fixed and returned each day. 2 assistants clamp your shoulders, a third presses a leather wad between your teeth so the steel has something to bite against. How much pain can you take? Speed is a fact. Surgeons traveled with roughly 40 instruments in a chest: scalpels, probes, saws, cauteries, and every minute saved cut the odds of a later infection. The herbs and wine dull edges, but not screams. You thrash if hands fail, limbs break free, or the blade slips, so orderlies pin you hard, or the operation ends in disaster. Brazier smoke stings the eyes as Caligae clack on packed earth outside. A ligature or a red-hot iron must seal vessels before the saw meets bone. When that work begins, the brazier's heat, and a single clean cut decide if you will march again. The consequence is immediate. 2 or 3 minutes of metal can save a man, but a messy procedure costs weeks in rot. A surgeon's chest carried roughly 40 instruments and a brazier. If herbs only dull edges, the saw and cautery decide whether you live. Vegetius warned commanders to keep surgeons and stores close. 4 orderlies commonly held a man. A surgeon's chest weighed about 12 kilograms and rode with the baggage train. Those 12 kilos mattered: a lost chest delayed care and raised deaths. 3 minutes with a saw or cautery often decided amputation and return to the line. Mules carried tools and carried men. Inside the medica, the field valetudinarium is clinical and immediate. A chest of some 40 instruments lies open. Saw's bronze forceps hooked levers arrow spoons. Celsus taught ligature or cautery to stop bleeding, and Galen insisted on controlling hemorrhage first. A ligature must bite or a hot iron seal, then the saw hums through wood-hard bone. Would you hold still? Arrowheads follow strict rules. Barbed points are pushed through smooth heads or scooped with a spoon, and every splinter is debrided because one remnant feeds fatal rot. Fractures are pulled straight, splinted with wood and linen, and shoulders reduced with hooked leverage, and a brutal twist speed is surgery's currency. The Casa del Chirurgo in Rimini returned hundreds of instruments, and contemporary military chests of 40 or more tools mirror what a cohort surgeon carried alongside rations and ropes. Honey and vinegar dressings, resin plasters, and boiled linen slow putrefaction, practices born of smell and outcome, not microbes. Vegetius warned that a filthy camp saps an army commander's enforced drains and burned refuse. The brazier hissed and pitch stung the air bandages steamed under oil. A fort valetudinarium might hold 300–500 patients. Amphorae of wine were rationed for washing. When amphorae ran low, washes dwindled and infection crept into wards. If you survive the first 3 days, you might reach a roof, and a real bed, yet unattended wounds invite silent infection that no saw can stop. Infection travels fast on exhausted mules. Within the Medica, the air tastes of wine and the sour sting of vinegar as orderlies dip bronze probes into warm amphorae and instruments clink in a chest of 40 or more tools. Celsus advised washing wounds with wine. Galen insisted on controlling bleeding first. Those were rules, not miracles. What saved men more, taste or time? Romans treated infection by sight, smell, and strict routine. Honey and resin dressings to keep tissue dry, salt and vinegar to flush out grime, lead ointments to ease pain, even as they crept toward chronic poisoning, and wool or linen packed into a wound, so that some surgeons could wait for laudable pus before closing a wound. Dirty bandages killed quickly, so capsari boiled linens or burned them when possible. Orderlies who failed that work often watched men die inside a day. If an arrow was pushed through or a bone sawed, the surgeon's brazier and a set of forceps finished work fast because delay meant rot. The sensory truth is simple. A wound that smelled sweet often meant life. A wound that reeked meant the end. Field surgeons learned to judge by odor and clock. The first 72 hours were decisive. Vegetius warned logistics and shelter governed survival. Quartermasters tallied litters and beds as carefully as spears. Tents commonly held 20 men. Overcrowding slowed recovery and exposed more men to contagion. 3 days is the test. Most fatal infections declare themselves within 72 hours. If you make it past them, the valetudinarium and the quartermaster decide whether you march again or are packed out for further care. A legion's valetudinarium could hold 300 patients. That capacity decided who returned to duty and who was kept ashore for care. Enter the wards behind the walls. Within the castra, you step into the valetudinarium, and the mood changes. Colonnaded corridors hush the camp's clatter, and wine stings the nose where wounds are washed. Surgeons move with procedure, not pity. A capsarius halls a stretcher. A medicus castrorum directs an optio, and the whole system is ranked to return men to the line. Galen learned in gladiator schools to stop bleeding before anything else, and Vegetius insisted that speed and order saved more men than heroics. Triage is brutal and scripted. Stay, carry, or castrate, and the decision sends you either to a 5-bed cubicle or to an isolation room where water channels run toward latrines so filth flows out. You feel bandage against raw skin. Honey and resin dressings gleam under sunlit courtyards as wax tablets record each name, pill, and ration. Instruments rattle, saws forceps bronze probes, and an assistant pours vinegar over a blade. A ligature or a hot iron follows, and soldiers who survive a saw often return months later with a shorter stride. Beds are narrow. A fortress valetudinarium could hold roughly 300–500 patients at once, so supplies were counted like weapons and linen boiled or burned to limit rot. Caligy clack on flagstones outside as clerks tally amphorae. Each amphora held roughly 25 liters of wine and could supply wound washing for 2 days. And when the amphorae stopped arriving, infection climbed fast. Polybius praised Roman order. Vegetius warned hospitals were only as good as their wagons and routes. Vegetius insisted 20 days of supervised convalescence and exercise decided fitness for the march. March again or be left behind. Within the camp, hospital recovery was run like a drill, precise, inspected, and timed. Rations shifted toward protein, wheat with salted meat and cheese, and herbal infusions from Dioscorides were doled out, while Galen's regimen of oil massage and active motion woke stiff joints. Splints were adjusted, scars carefully stretched, and tendons tested against sandbags and wooden weights as a centurion's eye decided whether you returned to shield work or were reassigned. Who gets to march again? Those who failed the test received a missio causaria, or were moved into clerical posts, gate duty, or even hospital service to keep experience in the garrison. If you survived the first 3 days after a field operation, you might be shifted from a canvas cot to a proper bed. A legion hospital could house roughly 300–500 patients at once, and supplies were counted like weapons. You heard the dull thud of sandbags as medics probed strength and range of motion, a sound that decided pay, pension, and life at the front. A capsarius was attached to each sentry to haul dressings and drag the wounded. Vegetius urged regular drill and 7 to 14 days of graded exercises to restore marching fitness. The sour tang of oil and boiled wine hung in the ward as men limbered and learned to bear weight again. Even after passing the tests, 1 in 5 men fell ill within a fortnight. Commanders diverted grain, water, and guards to latrines and quarantine to stop contagion. Rivers carried disease and secret death. Within the castra, the sound of running water was as strategic as the cornu drains hissed beneath wooden seats, while ward doors opened onto basins where men scrubbed with wine and vinegar. Vegetius warned that discipline kept an army alive, and commanders meant it. Forts piped clean channels to flush latrines, set aside isolation rooms, and ordered rations rotated to prevent putrid stores. Galen had urged washing wounds with wine. In practice, medics stocked amphorae of pasca, vinegar, and water, because it was safer than untested wells. Could vinegar beat the river? The smell of sharp sourness hung in the air, and orderlies boiled linens or burned them when they could because a filthy bandage killed faster than a blade. Surgeons carried chests of 40 or more instruments, and quartermasters logged jars of honey and salt like arms. The valetudinarium in a legionary fortress could hold 300–500 patients, roughly a tenth of a garrison under heavy strain. When eye infections clouded camps on dusty marches or malaria swept low plains, the response was logistical. Water sources checked, linen resupplies trucked forward, and the sick quarantined before tents filled. Polybius admired the camp's rapid trenching, and orderly drains. Ditches were dug several feet deep, and centurions posted 2 men each dawn to scrub basins. Quartermasters counted amphorae by capacity. An amphora approximately 26 liters, because 1 missed amphora could leave 10 men thirsty by noon, eroding morale and inviting fever. Caligy slapped the stone near the Principia, and the tang of pitch rose with dawn. Losing 10 amphorae emptied pasca stocks and forced rationing, a direct call to the quartermaster and the supply train. Quartermasters called for pack animals and the cursus to move stores. Pack mules decide a legion's fate. Inside the baggage train, amphorae of strong wine rattled against sacks of honey, bales of linen stripped from worn tunics, and bundles of wooden splints cut by engineers. The whole load slung behind mules that never stopped for long. A surgeon's chest carried 40 or more tools. The Casa del Chirurgo at Rimini yielded hundreds of instruments and ointment pots mirroring campaign kits, and Celsus recommended washing with wine, while Vegetius insisted supply discipline was non-negotiable. A full amphora held roughly 25 liters, about 30 kilos, and those weights opened blisters on muleteers' hands by noon. Fort gardens grew sage thyme and woundwort so crews could harvest dressings locally, but quartermasters still audited jars and boxes like weapons, because a missing cautery could bleed a cohort dry. Who paid that cost? On the march, medics rode beside the impedimenta bandage bearers, keeping linen stockpiles rotating, orderlies boiling cloth when they could, and specialists ready to swap a ligature for a cautery in seconds. Delays, measured in hours, turned clean wounds into rotting ones. The logistics were surgical wax tablet inventories, listed counts. Hospitals at bases held perhaps 300-500 beds, and supply priorities shifted the column's pace. If the train detained, the surgeon's tent emptied and recovery stalled. Polybius noted baggage trains decided battles. A pack mule bore roughly 90-120 kilograms. 3 might be needed for a full surgical chest, and those loads cut a march to 20-25 km a day, a pace that frayed hands and patience. Leather straps creaked and Calighi slapped river mud as muleteers cursed broken axles. Quartermasters logged roughly 400 ointment jars for a legion. A missing crate could cost lives when infection took hold. An empty chest could stall operations for 7 days and let wounds fester. Commanders measured healing by marching distance. Within the valetudinarium, the empire's kindness was folded into calculation. What counts as mercy when the machine needs you? Galen's casebooks and the Vindolanda tablets record choices more than miracles. A legion's hospital might hold 300-500 patients, roughly a tenth of a garrison, and a surgeon's chest often carried 40 or more instruments. Wine stung the air as metal hissed in it. Orderlies scrubbed and boiled linens because a clean bandage meant fewer dead men the next march. Triage was immediate and brutal. Stop bleeding close wounds or decide you cannot march. And every fix had a ledger. Cost saved men kept their pay, their experience, and the unit's cohesion. Those beyond repair faced medical discharge and a radically different life. Commanders and Medici worked from the same logic. Saving a soldier was saving tomorrow's column, and Galen's notes show surgeons judged utility as much as prognosis. Supplies mattered as much as skill. Amphorae of wine for washes, honey and resin for dressings, and counted beds dictated decisions in campaigns from Britain to the Danube. The consequence fell on bodies and bureaucracy. One man's healed limb returned to shieldwork, another's scar became a pension claim. Centurions gauged readiness by the march, not by sympathy. Vegetius later tallied a legionary's burden at roughly 30-40 kilograms, and a man unable to shoulder that load was shifted aside. Centurions set tests of 20 Roman miles to prove a healed limb. Failure moved a man to clerical posts or camp labor. The smell of pitch and wet leather marked arrival as boots met the yard. Vegetius tallied a legionary's burden at roughly 30-40 kilograms. A wounded man who could not shoulder that pack was reassigned, and Calighi on stone decide your fate. Centurions measured readiness by marches of 20 Roman miles. Failure redirected men from shields to scribal work, and mules would haul stretchers into tomorrow. One failed fitness report could trigger a missio causaria, and a pension file. Guards, clerks, or exile take you.